At the Child Mind Institute. We're a national nonprofit that supports children and families with gold standard mental health care, advice, and resources, all online and accessible to everyone. We are here for you wherever you are with the expert telehealth resources, including diagnosis and treatment of mental health and learning disorders, group programs for anxiety, mood disorders, ADHD, and more, remote neuropsychological evaluations. So please visit childmind.org/telehealth to learn more about these services. With protests over the violent deaths of Black Americans dominating the news, it's understandable that many kids are feeling scared, confused, or angry about the situation. We're all thinking about racism and violence and how to raise caring children and how to talk to them about what's happening in our society. We're happy to try and answer all your questions about whatever parenting challenges you have and the anxieties that you might be facing yourselves. Today, I'm here to talk a little bit specifically about managing ADHD at home, although, as I said, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have that you feel are relevant right now. So please post your questions in the feed, and we'll post some links to helpful resources on childmind.org. Remember, we're here every day, and we'll look forward to hearing your questions so that we can post important resources for you and relevant resources that are targeted to your needs. Thanks so much, guys, for joining us. I can see some people jumping in, but I want to kind of use some questions that we've gathered from previous Facebook Lives on this topic specifically. So the first question that I have here is, my son wants to stop taking his ADHD medication over the summer. What are the pros and cons of that? Really great question, and one that actually I do want to make sure I say first and foremost that absolutely should be discussed with your provider or your clinician, right? So whoever is providing the prescription for that medication should definitely be the one that you check in with about the pros and cons for your child specifically and for your situation specifically. In a general way, what I can say is that there can be pros and cons to, being more lenient with medication, again, with your provider's consent over the summer. I think it depends on what your goals and plans for the summer are and what your expectations for your child are in the summer. I think we want to think a little bit about what you need to accomplish and how the medication supports your child in expectations and kind of the daily, in terms of his daily functioning, because what we don't want to do is we don't want kids in the summer to be without the important coping skills that they developed all year. We don't want them to regress. We don't want them to lose strides. At the same time, and when you're talking with the provider and talking collaboratively with your child, if they're developmentally old enough to have these types of conversations with you, we also want to consider some of the benefits that might go along with being, again, more lax with medication in the summer, possibly your son or your child feeling less irritable, maybe gaining weight if that's a side effect of the ADHD medication. So I think there's definitely pros and cons. I would urge you to talk about those things with the provider first before you talk with your son about those possibilities, just in case the news is disappointing or you and your partner make a decision that your son may or may not really want to agree with. So I think talking with that provider first and then developing possibly even a list of pros and cons that you share with your son to help him to understand how you are making the decision. So hopefully that's helpful to some degree. And I know these are definitely complicated things. We have a question here about how can I get my ADHD daughter to follow instructions? So it's a really great question and one that I think is incredibly relatable for parents, even parents of children who don't have ADHD. But what we do know is that when a child with ADHD, there are a number of factors that make it more challenging for a child with ADHD to comply and follow directions at a high rate. First and foremost, I think it's important for parents to know and understand that on average, typically developing kids with no behavioral issues follow their parents' directions about 75% of the time on the first request. So I think it's important to have parents always think just a little bit about keeping compliance or following directions in perspective, and that we never anticipate that kids will follow 100% of directions on the first try. But that if your child isn't meeting the mark of 75% on the first try, that you do have some gains to make, or do have some room for improvement for sure, right? There's a lot of different strategies that you can use to increase a child's compliance. I think the very first and foremost is to actually think about the number of directions you're providing in the day. What we know about parent follow-through is that, especially during COVID times, it would be impossible for parents to follow through 100% of the time when they give a direction. And yet, children with ADHD may inadvertently learn that if we don't follow through with a high percentage of directions, they will learn, again, as inadvertently, that they don't actually have to follow directions the first time. So oftentimes I'm talking with parents about reducing the number of commands that they are giving to their child, or reducing the number of instructions that they give, so that they can increase their follow through, right? Oftentimes this looks for parents like just not repeating demands and waiting until you're ready to follow through with the demand before you actually give it. So if you're in the kitchen and you're thinking it would be great if your daughter put her shoes on, but you're not actually ready to go into the living room where she is and have her put those shoes on in that moment, I would not give the verbal direction yet. I wouldn't say, hey, Sarah, please put your shoes on. Or Sarah, why don't you think about getting your shoes on? I would not even start the direction until I was in close proximity to Sarah and had the wherewithal and the time to follow through with getting those shoes on. Because the more we give a direction and can follow through with it consistently, the more kids, not just children with ADHD, but particularly children with ADHD, will learn that their parents, when giving directions, are a brick wall, not a rubber band. Right? I have a colleague, Dr. Cheryl McNeil, who is instrumental in parent-child interaction therapy, which is a manualized treatment for children who have oppositional behaviors who are ages 2 to 7. And she talks a lot with parents about when they give a direction, picturing themselves in battle with their child, right? So once you give that direction, you're actually in battle, and you need to win that battle. You need to win those battles consistently. What that means is that sometimes you won't choose to get in the battle because you don't have time or you're not available to do those things. So again, decreasing your repeats, increasing your follow through. Another thing I would suggest is that whenever your child does follow a direction, and if they do it quickly without arguing after the first command, absolutely, this should be acknowledged, and your child should receive praise for having followed those instructions. While it's parental expectations that kids follow directions, we also know that kids don't always do it, and we still need to make sure that we're giving them positive attention for their efforts. So I've talked before on Facebook Lives about the difference between general praise and labeled praise. Any kind of praise is great, and we will take it. General praise is things like good job, way to go, high five. Labeled praise are things like, I love the way that you started your homework so quickly. Thanks so much for listening the first time I asked you. Great job getting your shoes on so quickly, right? So labeling your praise actually tells your child what it was about their behavior that you appreciated and liked. Any kind of praise is good, as I said, but if you put a label on it, you're going to get more of those specific behaviors. So, for instance, if someone says, Stephanie, you look good, I'm going to feel good. If they say, Stephanie, you look good in red, I'm going to buy more red sweaters, right? So the more you put a label on your praise, the more you're likely to see those appropriate behaviors. Additionally, children with ADHD are often not attending in that moment to all of their behaviors. So you putting a label on the praise also clues them in specifically to what actions and what behaviors you liked best, and is likely to increase the chances that your child is going to follow directions at a higher rate in the future. So I think, labeled praise, being really clear with those directions and expectations, making sure that you're following through if at all possible, and decreasing the number of directions if at all possible to make sure that you're able to be more consistent. So really, really great question. And again, one that I think is relatable to parents pre-COVID and post-COVID as well. Um, we had another previous question here about chores. And this is something that I know a lot of parents are wondering about, thinking a lot more about, especially since they're spending a lot more time with their kids on a daily basis. So this question here says, what are some good chores for my middle schoolers with ADHD? Really great question. I think it's most important to first consider what your baseline is, or what your kind of standard level of chores or expectations are for your middle schooler, right? Because that's first and foremost what we would need to kind of consider. If your middle schooler is doing no chores right now, no judgment, we get it, it happens. We also then want to be careful that the contrast between what we're doing right now and what we're expecting down the road isn't too stark for them. So the very first thing I would suggest is that you're increasing the demands or the expectations or the chores gradually. I think good chores will often center around things and skills that you want your child to develop independently, right? So rather than giving a chore that's designed to be busy work, maybe the chores are again, skill building related to things that you know your child is going to need more help with down the line. So a middle schooler could be involved in laundry, could be involved in clearing the table, could be involved in cleaning dishes. A middle schooler could also be involved with helping with meals, meal preparation, and those types of things. Your child, in taking on those chores, will learn more about how to do those things independently for themselves in the future. And I think linking chores to naturalistic consequences, like if you want to be able to make a cool dinner for your girlfriend or boyfriend down the line, or if you want to be able to, make your favorite food when you go to college, or when you're older and have a job and you're living on your own. I think the more that, again, you can link chores to real life circumstances and real life experiences, that not only the more functional are those chores, but they're a little bit easier and a little bit more palatable, I think, for kids and adolescents to take on and understand. There are certainly chores that are centered around cleaning. And so I think that you could certainly look at your house and think a little bit about what needs to be done in the house, and what level of intensity you would like your middle schooler to be helping out with those things. Again, though, it's important to consider your baseline. And so if your middle schooler is not doing any of those chores currently right now, you might want to start with one chore. And once you've gotten that chore to happen consistently across many days, or possibly even multiple weeks, and there's no argument related to that chore, it seems to be part of the routine and part of the structure now, then you add an additional chore in. I'd also really caution parents at this current time about adding additional things in that are going to create more aggravation or more conflict amongst parents and child, right? So if it's an idea, you might want to think about waiting until the school year is up, or waiting until your child's homework has decreased to some degree before you think about adding a chore in at this point, just to make sure that you're not making your life more challenging right now if it results in arguments or more prompting or negotiating that needs to happen on your part. So considering all of those factors. It's a really great question, and it reminds me of myself a little bit about some of the chores I had when I was in middle school, and kind of the expectations within my household. And I think it's important for parents to think about the culture of their household and what they want that to look like and feel like. That will also help parents to determine, should kids be paid for chores or not? Should it just be the expectation? Those types of things. I also know that we have a number of resources on childmind.org that relate to this question specifically. So certainly urge you to take a look at those additional resources as well. Okay, so we have another question here previously. Looks like we're trying to do some catch up over the summer. What would a good study schedule for a 7-year-old with ADHD look like? Excellent question, as I imagine that your 7-year-old is going to be ready for a break once summer comes, and might not be super enthused or excited or motivated to start a summer study schedule. And so the first suggestion that I would have is to make sure that you, your partner, whatever caregivers, adult caregivers are involved in this, are thinking strategically about the summer planning ahead of time and talking with your 7-year-old ahead of time about what that summer programming or expectations will look like, so that they don't automatically assume that they're going to have the summer off and not have any additional expectations. So right from the start, I would say setting the stage to make sure those things are clear. I think it's also important to think maybe a little bit about areas that your child was struggling in throughout the year, because those are the areas that you are going to want to look to maintain or make sure that there's no regression, right, in terms of those areas, right? So I think talking and collaborating with school staff that you have right now available to you, if at all possible, that's a great idea. And possibly asking them, the school staff who has probably been with your 7-year-old quite a bit of the day and has had previous experiences delivering these types of demands, I would certainly ask them a little bit about the schedule. I think that a 7-year-old with ADHD in the summer is absolutely going to need some time off, and they're definitely going to need some time to be involved in activity outside and moving and grooving, maybe in the house if at all possible, on a trampoline, or doing a scavenger hunt, or doing go noodle breaks, movement breaks, or these types of things. I would say that your 7-year-old, you want to think again in the day about what it is you want to accomplish from an academic standpoint. Is it 30 minutes of academics each day? Is it really 30 minutes of academics in the morning and then 30 minutes of academics in the afternoon, which I think would be reasonable to some degree? It's not going to be as important about duration of time as much as tasks accomplished in that time. And so I think it's also important to maybe start with really brief periods of time and really a short number of tasks, or a very limited number of tasks that your child needs to complete in the summer and the day, so that they're interested and motivated to come back. I'd also possibly link some of those expectations to access to preferred items or activities. So making sure that less preferred activities are immediately followed by fun activities or more preferred activities. In terms of remediation and kind of how long your child needs to be spending each day, really, again, I would take some of those cues from teachers and school staff who probably know your child's academic needs a little bit better than I do. That being said, you want to also consider the culture of your family and the expectations that your family has in terms of summer. So while it may make sense to do a little bit of work each day, it might also make sense to actually decide to do quite a bit of work on Mondays and Tuesdays and give your child the rest of the week off, if you on Mondays and Tuesdays have a little bit more time to devote to the activities or academic activities. So being as strategic as you possibly can about those times, I think will be really beneficial. Really, really great question. Let's see here. It looks like we have just a couple more questions about ADHD and just kind of structuring things, following up. And this one here is about managing behavior related to ADHD and disappointment. So this question here is about another 7-year-old. My 7-year-old daughter is pretty upset about expectations that she was having for the summer being canceled. Her ADHD makes it so that her ability to regulate her behavior is pretty compromised. Do you have any advice? So again, a really great question, and one I know that a lot of parents are struggling with, given all of the shifts and expectations and summer camps being closed and those types of things. We want to make sure that we are validating and empathizing with your daughter's disappointment first and foremost, right? So I think I've talked about it on previous Facebook Lives, but when kids are disappointed or anxious, we want to use the 2 E's, right? Which is out of Philip Kendall's manualized treatment for kids with anxiety coping cat, right? Where we use empathy and encouragement. So we're letting your child know, I hear you, I hear that these things are disappointed. And then we're shifting to the second E, which is encouragement, where we're letting her know, and I know that we can work through these things together. I know that we'll be able to kind of manage your disappointment and still have a good time this summer. I think it's also important to make sure that your daughter understands that behavior that's dangerous or unsafe, aggressive, non-compliant is truly not acceptable regardless of disappointment. So making sure that kids do understand, particularly children with ADHD who might be a little bit less in tune to social cues or social expectations, making sure that she's aware it's okay to be disappointed. It's okay to yell or to journal about it or to cry a little bit about it and then those types of things. It is never okay to hit your sister. It is never okay to curse at me or whatever it is your household rules are related to those types of things. So making sure that there's some clarity for your child about how they can express their disappointment appropriately, given the intensity of their disappointment, but then also where the limits and boundaries are related to behavioral expectations. We also want to make sure, again, that kids get praised and rewarded for being flexible, for keeping their calm and keeping cool when they're upset. So I think that this is a great time for parents to incorporate that type of language into their vernacular. So saying things like, I love the way that you stayed calm when you were disappointed, or I like how you're being flexible even though your preference is to be able to play with your friends right now. So making sure, again, that we're acknowledging those things, and especially for a child with ADHD who, as I said before, might be a little bit less in tune to the social cues or the social expectations around them, making sure that we're filling those things in for them. Really, really great question. All right. So I think that if we don't have too many other questions coming in, I can talk just a little bit too about some questions that I've been hearing a lot in my sessions from parents that are struggling with these types of concerns. I'm thinking a little bit about a family that I was working with just a couple days ago who was talking about their daughter, who's about 14 years old, who is experiencing a lot of anxiety about kind of transitioning back into the fold and asking parents a lot of questions about these things, asking peers a lot of questions about these things. So I think that's something that's, again, on a lot of parents' minds. And I think, 14-year-old or 7-year-old, we're using the same themes and the same foundations, right? We're being empathic about our kids' concerns and their worries, and then we're also being encouraging. We want to make sure that kids are not exposed to or not over accessing information given the stress of these current times, but making sure that we control the narrative of what they're hearing from media and from the news and things like that, asking them where they're getting their information from. So rather than just kind of allowing them to just unload their questions on you, even asking them, where are you getting that information? Tell me more about that. When do you think about that most? How do you think I can be helpful? Sharing with your kids even how you have maybe put some limits yourself on accessing information or ways that you distract or cope when you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed. Making sure that parents are a little bit more meta in their coping mechanisms, right? So being meta, talking out loud about their experiences and making sure that they're not just modeling these things for kids, but also talking about them out loud so that if a child with ADHD isn't able to concentrate or attend to the parts of a social interaction or a coping interaction that we've displayed for them, that we're actually verbalizing those things and following up, reinforcing to those topics with our kids later, so that we can think through those things. That particular family, we've also talked just a little bit about creating like a bravery brag book for their daughter, where we are able to kind of acknowledge and highlight times throughout the week when she's been particularly brave or has put away her worries, compartmentalized them in a way that's allowed her to be a little bit more functional or a little bit more engaged in fun activities or social activities. So again, thinking about ways to acknowledge and highlight when your child does actually use the coping skills or does kind of put effort into their coping and flexibility, which we know can be challenging. We know adults that have difficulty with those types of things. Really, really good question. Or really, good thoughts about kind of how we're progressing through these uncertain times. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for joining us today and hoping that this was helpful. But just kind of in closing, thank you so much for joining me today and for your previous questions as well. We do hope that these resources are helpful, and we want you to remember that we're here every day to support you during this extraordinary time. The Child Mind Institute is here to help with mental health and parenting needs of this coronavirus crisis, no matter where you are. So please visit childmind.org/telehealth to learn more about the incredible variety of remote telehealth resources we have available during this time for children, teens, and young adults. Please, please, please be safe, be well, and thanks so much for joining us.